This is the Energizing India podcast.
Over the last 4 years, the top 20 global economies have been in the midst of an energy transition, moving towards clean mobility and clean energy. The ability of countries to leverage the benefits of this transition is governed by access to critical raw materials such as lithium, manganese, and cobalt, or on the other end of the spectrum, critical rare earth materials used in semiconductors or hydrogen fuel cells. This access to raw material, based on the politics of each of these economies, is often controlled either by friends, allies, or as is the case for India, by strategic competitors. It is the great game of the 21st century, often referred to in boardrooms as geopolitics. Today, in this unique edition of the Energizing India podcast, we take a very high-level view of this great game of geopolitics and welcome to our program a very special guest. Vijay GOKHALE was a distinguished figure in the Indian Foreign Service with a career that spanned 3 decades. He served in key diplomatic posts including Beijing, Hong Kong, Hanoi, and New York. Vijay was also previously India's ambassador to Beijing, High Commissioner to Malaysia, and also India's ambassador in Germany. As the Indian Foreign Secretary from 2018 to 2022, Vijay also played a pivotal role in the negotiations of the Doklam standoff with China. He's had a key role in strengthening India's relationships with strategic partners such as the United States, Russia, and Japan. Vijay is also a respected author, having written a book called Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, which offers deep insights into China's political landscape. In this episode, we discuss how China achieved such great economic success within just 2 decades, how China sees its role in the world, and also how China sees India. We also covered what the potential outcomes could be for Taiwan and the present war in Ukraine. Each of these has a bearing on the outcomes of the energy transition for the top 20 global economies. Vijay, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's not often that we get someone as experienced as yourself on this program, and there's so many subjects that we want to delve on. The first one, of course, that I'd like to talk about is the big white elephant in every boardroom in India, and that's China. China attempted the great leap forward in the 60s, actually achieved it from 2000 to 2024 when they were actually behind India in many ways, but today are so far ahead in economic size, capability, standard of living. And then in the last 4 years, they've achieved it all over again in the energy transition. Just when you look at the sheer size and technological leap that they've made for hydrogen, lithium, electric vehicles. How did this happen? What is it about their system that allowed them to achieve this?
Well, for one thing, they began their reform about 10 years before we actually did. This started in the early 1980s, largely because the Communist Party had virtually destroyed its economy and industry during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976. And the party realized that if it did not modernize the economy and meet the aspirations of the people, the socio-economic aspirations, the party might lose power. So that was when the reform process began. And although it was not visible to the outside world, what essentially changed in the 1980s was mindset. The old bureaucratic mindset was replaced by a new slogan, which was reform and opening up. And the leadership under Deng essentially told the Chinese bureaucracy that it was all right if communist ideology was not strictly followed, and if some people became richer than others quicker. The objective being that eventually everyone would be pulled up by the economic growth. And that's exactly what happened. I think great credit has to be given to the Chinese leadership that they stuck to this course despite some ups and downs, most particularly in 1989 when the Tiananmen incident occurred, when it would have been prudent for them to scale back. They in fact sort of stepped up the pace on reform. And one of the big things they did, among many others, was they invested hugely in education and in science and technology, including bringing people of Chinese origin who had emigrated abroad and who were at the cutting edge of technology back to China with inducements and with the promise that they could do what they liked, work as they wished, and that they could actually achieve what they wanted to in China, and they didn't have to remain in the United States. So in a sense, although from 2000 onwards the Chinese economy took off, the blocks for the Chinese economic growth were actually laid from the mid 1980s to the end of the 1990s, both in terms of policy, because they had liberalized, they had opened up to the West, they had started innovation and so on, and in terms of actually preparing their population for this new era by better education, more science and technology, and so on. And therefore, from the year 2000, we really saw a very rapid growth of the economy. I think the West made the mistake of thinking that this was essentially a copycat economy. In other words, that they were simply either copying or stealing technology or reverse engineering technology. I'm sure some of it was, but then all economies, when they start, actually do reverse engineering and copying. But I think what the West missed was this massive investment in education and science and technology. And therefore, very quietly, because China is not an open system, there's no free press, there's no parliament, there's no public opinion, it was easy to miss this silent revolution taking place in universities, in factories, in other institutions, in the Chinese military as well, because that's where a lot of research took place. And then you suddenly see, after the global financial crisis, that China is able to compete across the board with the West in technology, whether it is high-speed trains, whether it is cars, whether it is renewable energy, whether it is space, whether it is atomic energy, and so on. And that caught the West by surprise. So I think this is not a short-term fix. This is a very long-term plan that has been rolled out by a leadership which understands that the 21st century is going to be an age of technology, and that China has lagged behind and cannot afford to do so.
Very interesting that you talk about the 20-year policy, the investment in education and defense. In fact, having been to China recently, one of the things that struck me was all of the companies that we visited who are strategic competitors to ours, their land and building was provided free by the government. They had massive laboratories to do the testing and development of their products, with facilities, more advanced than what you would have even at the ARAI in Pune for the automotive industry. They had 100 to 200 people in research and development doing a number of, patent building activities, all paid for by the government. So they're not on the balance sheet or the P&L of the company. This creates, in fact, some sort of an unfair advantage almost. And I'm not even sure if this is coming from tax rebates or tax revenues, or is just printing money to create this. But when you go to Europe, you see in cities like Stockholm, Chinese electric buses. You see Siemens has had to do a deal with a Chinese company to get hydrogen technology, which is breathtaking. The fact that, Europe is going to be swamped by China. And it almost seems to me like this strategy by the Chinese government over 30 years that you're talking about now is almost the new colonialism, the new East India Company, because they build an unfair advantage on cost and tech, which means that the traditional developed world is unable to compete because they're 3x or 4x in cost, 3x or 4x in time, just uncompetitive. Their ecosystems can be destroyed, and there will be this reliance on China for all products, and therefore almost these economies becoming vassal states to China. Do you see it from your perspective similarly?
Well, this question has to be sort of addressed at more than one level. I think the first issue is, did they act unfairly by giving certain advantages to their companies in terms of land or building or even credit? And the answer is that when any economy starts growing, a certain amount of government support is necessary. And I very much recall that when I was in university, the same accusation was made against the Japanese.
That's true.
Now, we of course forget that on the other side, the West has had a stranglehold on technology for the last 50 or 60 years. And if you do not give that sort of advantage to your companies, particularly in the developing countries, you will never actually technologically catch up. You will always be dependent on the West. So I really don't sympathize with the view that China was unfair in subsidizing or in somehow assisting its industry through free land or cheap capital or because labor prices were low to develop technology. Right. Now, the problem is that China's strategy is once it develops an industry, it develops it on a huge scale. Yes. And then the objective is to completely shut out any other potential competitor. And the way that it is done is through price fixing or lowering of prices initially. Now, that is where the state's intervention, the Chinese government's intervention, should be deemed unfair. Because what it does is, because it gives certain benefits, including large subsidies as well as export loans and so on, it allows Chinese companies to sell products for a prolonged period of time at relatively lower prices than anybody else can manufacture them at, and therefore hollow out the industry in those countries. And a typical example in India, in fact in the city we are sitting in, Pune, is the pharmaceutical industry. Until 2005, we were a leading manufacturer of active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, which go into the pharmaceutical industry. Today we import over 60% of it, and almost all of it from China. And that's because China could manufacture many more of the APIs on scale. It then was able to sell it cheaper to Indian companies making drugs and generics, and that killed the API industry. And now China commands a premium in the market. As to how it was financed, the whole economic growth, I think that there lies an interesting tale. What China essentially did was it used the vast land bank it had, because in China, there is no such thing as privately owned property. It's all in the state's ownership. So what they did was they used that land, they monetized the land essentially. They offered it to investment companies who bought it from them. And then subsequently it was developed into either infrastructure or residential or commercial use. And the revenue generated from that was what the state used to subsidize infrastructure growth and other activities of the state. So in a sense, it was at one period of time a sustainable way of doing things, because you didn't overtax the people. There was no need to raise revenues from various other means, because the revenue came from the land which you owned. The problem is that cycle has almost run its course. China has built infrastructure beyond what it requires. There are very large areas where residential units are now uninhabited or with excessive supply. And therefore, what's happening is nobody's building more, which means land sales or land lease revenues are falling. And therefore, the state's budget is falling as well. So in a sense, it's caught up. The sins have caught up. And going forward, China is going to have to find other ways of financing. But what we therefore should be concerned is not so much what they did in trying to catch up in the technology race, because frankly, that's what every developing country does, but how the state continues to help those countries, help China sort of subvert the markets in other countries through means which countries like India or other open systems cannot do, because you have to have one rule for everybody. And I think there the world has become more and more aware of the game that China plays. We have also got to admit that the West turned a blind eye for a very long time, simply because it was such a good market for their products, and their products were so superior to what the Chinese could make that they could afford to turn a blind eye. They're not doing so now because, of course, the Chinese have caught up and their own products are being beaten in competition. But we have to guard against this, because I think the view that India should not necessarily manufacture everything, we are part of a global supply chain, we should allow Chinese products to come in, I think has to be done with a bit of regulation and a bit of caution. Of course, we can't make everything. Frankly, there is a global supply chain these days, and it is not even economically viable to make everything. But the answer is not to simply open your market for Chinese products to be dumped, because the objective is essentially to hollow out your economy.
So let's talk about regulation then, because I wonder if we're heading to two ecosystems almost, the Chinese dependent ecosystem and the Western one. Europe is a complicated place. You've got the common market, the EU, many countries that are trying to make regulations, and you've got one spectrum Hungary, on the other spectrum Germany, and Germany relies on China, France maybe less so, and so it's very difficult to set up a fortress. Yet, when I look at the perspective of Indian industry wanting to compete, Indian industry at the moment, at where we are in our development and our cost economics, can only compete against Chinese companies in fortresses where there are overt tariffs or barriers to entry for Chinese products. And if you look at that, that's India, for example, but there's the United States and maybe some of the Five Eyes countries, Canada, the UK, to some extent Australia. Australia is also semi-dependent on a lot of resources from China or to sell to China. In such a context, we have a problem that all of these countries have learnt their lesson from China and therefore are a little wary about India. It doesn't help that our quality cost is not as competitive. Sometimes we're arrogant in our policies as well. How do you see this evolving? What do we need to do? Because we're in some ways caught in a hard place. It is going to be geopolitics that decides if India can be an exporter, and it'll have to be to friendly countries that want to invest in India to do what they did with China 24 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think firstly, we are going to be increasingly moving into a world which might look multipolar, but in fact has very strong bipolar features. Mm-hmm. And that's not just from the geopolitical perspective, it's going to be there from the technology perspective as well. You have the West, that is the United States and countries like Germany or France or the UK, which are advanced in technology and closely linked to each other. And then you have China, which is the other big technology player in the game. Really, these two increasingly, because there's a structural problem between the United States and China, there is increasingly a tendency by the United States to build barriers where high technology is concerned, not where trade is concerned, but where high technology is concerned, which of course is intended to prevent China from catching up, but which the rest of the world is going to be caught up in terms of having to make a choice as to whether we go in for US technology and then we are denied a cheaper, perhaps better technology from China, or whether we go in for Chinese technology, in which case we're denied American components and services and software which might go into that technology. Now, frankly, for a country like India, the only answer is we have to build and make our own technology. I think the era of simply saying that the Chinese technology is not good because there may be bugs in it and there are security issues doesn't answer the question which begs itself, that are we saying that American technology is not intrusive either? Because we know that the West also engages in industrial espionage on a humongous scale. So I think if you really want to secure the well-being of the country economically and geopolitically, it has to be by building up your own technology, not necessarily by saying we will go with a trusted technology of a second or a third country. Now, that is not to say that we should go into an autarkic mode. And I hope Atmanirbharta is not, which is what the government's policy is not autarky, which is you build high walls and then you live within them. I think what we need to do is recognize that there are certain core sectors where we need to do massive investment in technology, education, and machinery, and that includes all the cutting-edge industries. It includes space. It includes that is aerospace. It includes railways. It includes the whole issue of electric vehicles and storage solutions, semiconductors, high-speed internet. In these sectors, we must put in much more of financing and encourage our own private sector to develop so that we develop alternative technologies and are not entirely dependent on the West. For the rest of the manufacturing process, which is what mature industries are, I think their globalization should be allowed to flourish, and you cannot have high tariffs for manufacturing buckets or sort of electronic consumer goods, clothing, or jewelry and so on, because frankly, then you're not preparing your companies for competition. And companies can't be selectively competitive. You can't tell a company, I'll protect you on jewelry, but you go and compete on technology. It doesn't work like that. We prepare our industry for competition, and we protect the core industries from excessive competition with others, at least until they are mature. This is essentially what the Chinese and the Americans are doing anyway. There are core industries in China where foreign investment is either not permitted or heavily controlled, and all sorts of conditions are placed on foreign investors relating to transfer of technology, IPR, and so on. And in the US, it's the same. I mean, they're setting up high walls of technology denial around very limited industries. The rest of it is open, but here the walls are so high that nobody can get in.
Yes.
And I think therefore that then brings us to the geopolitical challenge. How do we tackle the United States and China in this situation where we are, at the moment at least, benefiting from both? And I think we must be frank in admitting we are benefiting from China. A lot of our intermediate goods, a lot of our semi-finished products which go into our high-end exports like pharmaceuticals or electronics comes from China. But where we shouldn't be dependent on either, certainly not in the cutting-edge technologies, I think is our challenge.
So 2 fast questions on that very subject. Do you think the United States is a dependable ally for India, given the long road we had from 1947 being part of the non-aligned movement, but really more Soviet-leaning, and today being in an unfriendly neighborhood needing their support?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, in geopolitics, there is no such thing as a permanent ally or a permanent adversary. The British Prime Minister of the 19th century, Lord Palmerston, said that a country only has permanent interests. And our interests will always be permanent as a very large semi-continental state with the world's largest population and one of the world's largest economies. We cannot afford to align or ally with any other country so completely that you give up your sovereignty. So I think it's clear to me that we have to find a way to navigate the next 10 to 15 years, which is when we are developing, without actually being completely dependent. Now, in that circumstance, the United States is still today the country which has the capital, the technology, and the market. And you need all three of them. Capital perhaps less, technology certainly a lot of, and the market too. We are still a Western focused market. And China's market is difficult to penetrate. It is discriminatory. It is, the barriers, there are many barriers from language to government. And therefore, for us, the relationship with the United States will remain the key relationship. Now, how we maintain that strategic balance, therefore, is important, and I think the government has done a fairly good job of maintaining that strategic balance. So if you look at both the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Hamas conflict, we have not sided with the United States. In fact, the US sometimes feels a little concerned that we are not sort of being hard on Russia, that we are giving Russia a pass and in fact helping the Russian economy by buying oil. So in that sense, I think we've navigated this fairly well. Of course, it's difficult to navigate. It's not that we will always be successful, but I think we have the experience to do so. So I would certainly conclude by this. I think the United States is our most important strategic partner. Whether they are reliable or not is not the point. They are a partner we need, and therefore we have to do what is necessary to keep them as a major partner. China is an adversary. We need to prepare to manage that relationship, but we cannot allow it to sort of come down into conflict. Obviously, that's not good for our economy. There are a number of middle powers which share our thinking on both the United States and China. That includes Europe, by the way, but it also includes important Asian countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Indonesia, Korea, and so on. We have to make common cause with them. And if you look at Indian foreign policy over the last 20 odd years, I would say, from Mr. Vajpayee through Dr. Manmohan Singh to Mr. Modi, I think broadly this is what all governments have done. There's always a little, tweak that governments give depending on whether they're right of center or left of center. But essentially, every one of them has strengthened relations with the United States, developed relations with Europe, opened a new relationship with the Gulf and the Middle East, kept a relationship with Russia, and handled China with care.
So I'm going to ask a question that I know everybody asks in their living rooms when China comes up on TV during dinner conversations. And that is, do you really reckon, from all of your years of experience, that the India-China border conflict will ever be resolved?
I think it will be managed for many, many years because sentiments are involved on both sides. And I think after the Galwan incident, even the unlikely prospect of an early resolution has become more unlikely. Because a whole new generation of Indians have been made aware that China has adopted a sort of aggressive, assertive posture towards India. So I think in this circumstance, unless I'm very much mistaken, the absence of mutual trust will mean that you can't really resolve a territorial dispute, because in a territorial dispute there is give and take, and for that political will needs to be exercised. After all, you're giving away sovereign territory,
yes,
either side. So I think, but what can be done is it can be managed. In other words, you accept you won't be partners, you agree you won't be adversaries, you accept that there'll be problems in that relationship, but there is common ground, and there is plenty of common ground in India-China relations. Energy is one big common ground that we have. The global trading rules, in general, global rules of even on intellectual property, this is all area where we have common ground with China. How do we manage this relationship to ensure there's no mishap is the key. And I think since we are talking on the eve of the formation of a new government in India, I think that will be one of the priorities of any incoming government.
So the world has become a very complicated place since 2022. Lockdown seems to have spat us out into a very different world. We've had Russia walk into Ukraine. We've had Hamas attack Israel, and then the very predicted response of Israel in the West Bank, or in Gaza, sorry. And now we have the prospect of potentially trouble brewing with China and Taiwan. We have a government in China that is in a hurry, wants to see this resolution of the Taiwan issue. So when you look at it from their perspective, they are a superpower and there's this little island that they can't claim as their own. You could almost hark back to Kashmir, to Cyprus, to, you could pick a conflict anywhere in the world and you'd have similarities. And, you can forgive them for thinking it's theirs. And yet at the same time, in February 2024, the United States created a permanent ground forces presence in Taiwan, which is almost an escalation of this. Where, from all of your years' experience, because I know you've looked at this from many angles, where's this headed and how will it end?
Yeah, well, I think firstly we have to recognize that we are in the midst of great change. And that great change is that the global order which the United States built after the Second World War is gradually disintegrating. Now, that does not mean that the United States is not still the most powerful country in the world, or that the change is going to come in the next 5 to 6 or 10 years. But I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Hamas conflict and the inability of the United Nations to effectively stop either of them is symptomatic of that changing world order in which the United States can no longer police the world alone, and where other countries do not necessarily feel the need to acquiesce to whatever the United States wants. And this situation is going to develop to a greater and greater degree simply because not only is China now a balancing force to the United States, but many other countries, including India, but not just including India, even countries like Turkey, Indonesia, South Korea, and some of the big European states feel that there is no need to take a side between the two major powers, because interests dictate that we chart a middle course, or that we make common cause with one or the other on issues, or that we make common cause as a third front. So the result of this is going to be an increasing inability by either of the two major countries to really control the world order. And therefore, you're going to have more and more localized conflicts, disputes, and such issues. Now, of course, the Taiwan issue is not just one of these disputes. It's probably going to be the major problem of the 21st century, simply because the interests of the two largest powers in the world, and they are likely to remain the two largest powers in the next 10 to 20 year time frame, their interests are involved. China's, because as you explained, it's part of China's territory. China has always claimed it. The world recognizes it, and it's still not under their control. The United States, because they have always championed themselves as the defender of the free world, of democracy. And here is a region, because we don't recognize Taiwan as a country. Here is a region or a territory which has had long-standing relationship with the United States, which is actually a true democracy and a practicing one, and where if it is extinguished and the United States is not able to do anything, its own credentials as a global leader will be called into question. And the whole Pacific order, which is anchored by the United States, will fragment. Because if you can't protect an ally and a fellow democracy, why would any other democracy in the Asia Pacific ever trust you? So it's an existential problem for both, and that's why it's not just any old hotspot, it's a real hotspot. Now, I think the second point I want to make is we should have no doubt that if China really wants to take Taiwan even today, it can do so. If it is willing to sacrifice blood and treasure and risk a certain amount of retaliatory response, it can actually directly or indirectly cause enough harm for Taiwan to fold. The issue is not that. The issue is what the global repercussion for China will be economically as well as geopolitically to doing this. And I think that cost has to be determined, because while the United States may not be able to stave off an invasion, it still controls a lot of global networks. The primary one, of course, being the dollar. The dollar is king, and nothing moves in the world if the United States wants to clamp down, because the SWIFT system is basically controlled by the United States. So, and that's not the only thing. They still hold an edge on technology. Their military equipment is still far superior to the Chinese. They have more allies than the Chinese in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific now. And therefore, China will face major economic, social, geopolitical, and military consequences on the takeover of Taiwan. The question is, are they willing to pay the price? And as I see it, the jury is still out on this. There is an emotional quotient which the West does not understand where Taiwan is concerned. At the same time, at least my experience of dealing with the Chinese is they are a very pragmatic and logical people, rational people. And this is a regime or a government with highly qualified, technically qualified leaders. And it is a cadre-based party. This is not a Putin-esque regime where it is dependent on one man, right? If theoretically Xi Jinping were to go today, there are plenty of other equally capable leaders who could take over. And therefore, every decision will be weighed very carefully before it is done. I think that is heartening for the rest of the world. In other words, you're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction in Taipei. But notwithstanding that, I think for governments not to prepare for that eventuality would be, in my opinion, a strategic mistake. Because if not now, certainly before 2049, the Chinese government will take some moves to recover it. They could be entirely peaceful, they could be semi-military, they could be completely military, difficult to say. But my own sense is 2049 is a hard stop. The 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. By then, China's GDP probably is equal to or has crossed that of the United States. It simply is not tenable that they are not in control of Taiwan.
So there is an alternative opinion that it's in fact the lifetime of Xi, because he's a man in a hurry and wants to leave a legacy. And having been to China only, in a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that struck me is they've completely disconnected their banking system from the world. So when we talk about SWIFT, so international credit cards don't work at all. They don't use cash at all. You have to use WeChat Pay or Alipay from Alibaba. And those networks, the Alipay networks, do not accept any card that's not Chinese. So you need a local ID, you need a local bank account. And so it becomes incredibly complicated unless you're staying in a Marriott group property, where only at the reception, not even at the restaurants, you can use your international credit card. So it does seem like they are trying to accommodate for the repercussions you're talking about?
No, not yet. They are, of course, trying to do that. But I think all this decoupling they've done on whether it's on WeChat or on Alipay or on their own credit cards or on their own, even their own internet systems, is only part of the answer. The answer, trade is still denominated in dollars, and despite China's best efforts to denote a lot of the trade in the renminbi, it hasn't really been able to do so. Even their own projects abroad under Belt and Road are all dollar denominated projects. Because there's no convertibility on the capital account, and there is no program to do so because China fears capital flight, how would the renminbi then become a reserve currency like the dollar? And until it becomes that, why would anyone want to completely move all their trade to renminbi? So I think the Chinese very well realize that dollar hegemony is a problem they have to deal with. Now, they are trying everything possible to break that dollar hegemony, increasing the renminbi's acceptability the world over, getting more and more countries to do direct business with them, trying to develop an alternative financial messaging system which will bypass the SWIFT. But so far, they haven't been able to achieve it, right? So that's one problem. The other is, while leaders want to leave behind legacies, they also have to, these are people who are, as I said, the Chinese are very rational people. They don't want to leave devastation behind. And at the moment, I think they perhaps judge that the global reaction to the use of force will be devastating. The thing is that there are plenty of options short of the use of force, which I think could be enormously disruptive. And as I said, therefore, any government not to start factoring this in would be a mistake, because a naval blockade or a quarantine or a blockage of airspace, cutting of internet cables, delaying the movement of shipping in the Taiwan Strait. Now, none of these is going to invoke an American military response because you can't, but is enough to disrupt global trade and supply chains. And therefore, we have to really start focusing on this. And I hope we are.
It'll be very interesting because the collapse of the supply chains over Corona showed us how dependent we are on China, and how entire industry segments can come to a standstill. Not just pharmaceutical, but a lot of the day-to-day industry can come to a standstill. So I do not see in the boardrooms yet globally, not in Australia, not in India, not in the US, discussions around supply chain risk. I think we're still sleepwalking into this zone, much like the First World War. I was watching John Mersheimer's podcast on Europe, and how most of Western Europe is happy to have NATO because they've almost subcontracted the geopolitical protection to America. And the moment America withdraws, suddenly Germany and France become strategic competitors in the defense space. France wouldn't be really happy with Germany being more powerful, and Poland would be nervous with Germany taking that role. Hungary would be nervous as well. So there's two questions going through my head on this. In fact, three. One is, if America pulls out of NATO or destabilizes NATO, which could well happen based on whatever happens in the elections, given how close they came last time, is Europe a dependable ally in this, repercussions to China? And secondly, what is the future scenario of Russia and Ukraine? Where is this war going to end? And the elections in the US, is that going to have an impact on how this war ends?
Yeah, well, let me begin by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think we need to sort of do a reality check on what the West is saying. The fact of the matter is that the war has reached a stalemate. Perhaps the Russians may not be able to advance, but there is almost no probability that the Russians will be dislodged from where they are. So effectively, even if the Russians haven't achieved 100% of their objective, they've achieved a majority of their objective, and Ukraine isn't going to get territory back. So in a sense, it's a war of attrition where the balance is shifted from Russia being on the back foot to Ukraine being on the back foot, and therefore Europe being on the back foot. The extent to which the Europeans insist on drawing out this conflict will depend on whether on the 5th of November, Biden returns to office or Trump becomes president of the United States again. Because one of the promises which Trump has made, it's not necessary, of course, that he may keep it as president, but what he said is that he will make Europeans pay more for the war, and that he will, if necessary, also amend or adjust American policy towards NATO. So I think we have to wait for that. But the short point is the Europeans we have to understand, are deeply distressed about this conflict, because for the first time since the Second World War, it is a conflict on their soil. When they thought that this was all in the past and they were telling others how to manage their affairs, they find that their own affairs are in a bigger mess than the affairs of others. So they are sort of heavily invested in the Ukraine conflict. If the Americans pull out, they will have to invest even more, because there is a genuine fear that the Russians might follow an expansionist policy. In any case, the United States and Europe were not on the same page on China. They never were. The Europeans really have no strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific. It's an economic interest. It's a geo-economic interest in China in terms of technology, IPR, market access for goods and services. Of course, they have the same concerns as the Americans, which is the Chinese are trying to restrict market access, steal technology and drive the European companies out of the Indo-Pacific. But if the American market also becomes difficult, as Trump is promising by raising tariffs, then of course the European reaction is, why should we simultaneously alienate both markets? So they are still very much with one foot in China. So far as we are concerned, look, our interest in Europe is essentially first the market access there, secondly the access to technology from German and other companies. I don't think, frankly, we have much interest in how the Europeans look at China. We are not competing with them in China on products. And I think I have some sympathy with the Germans, for instance, because I've been ambassador to Germany, who tells me, if you want us to walk out of the Chinese market, which is what the Americans are suggesting, can you, India, pick up the slack? And obviously you can't. As somebody who headed Mercedes was telling me once, we sell 1.5 million cars in China, we sell 50,000 or 100,000 in India. So do we have a choice? We don't have any other market. And therefore, if you aren't willing to pick up the slack and the Americans are going to be difficult, we have to stay on in China. So I think at the end, we are too big a country to be dependent on others. We have to chart our own course. It's going to be difficult, but we have to do it.
So interesting view from Germany on India. I was struck by a question often asked also. What is the perception of India in terms of the government of China? Quite often, we read that China sees us as the enabler of the subjugation of China when the British came into Hong Kong and took parts of Shanghai, because it was the Indian army and it was Indian artillery that was fighting it and maintaining it. And therefore, there is this revenge factor, or there is this dark view of India. What, in your experience, what is the view of India from China?
No, I don't think that is the view at all, and it has never been the view. I think if you actually ask ordinary Chinese about the historical view of India, it is almost uniformly positive, because they see Buddhism as having come from there. They see India as some sort of a religious, spiritual place from where spirituality originated, and many of their epics, particularly their famous epic, The Journey to the West, essentially is about India and about how India is the home of a lot of knowledge and spiritualism, and great monks from China traveled there and brought back knowledge. So there's a deep respect for Indian civilization. And the Chinese, being a civilizational state, to respect other civilizational states, states which have survived for centuries and millennia, with ups and downs, but have survived. And certainly India is one of those, and China has respect. I think at a more current level, you have to differentiate between public opinion and those who make decisions. Public opinion is highly controlled in China, simply because there's no access to material the way we have access to it. There's no parliament, so there are no debates with an alternative view. There is no media, so there's no alternative view. The internet is heavily controlled. You can't, as you know, access Google, Facebook, Meta, and so on in China. So they essentially are dependent on what they are being told, and what they are being told is that India has, since 1947, engaged in certain behavior towards China, including harboring the Dalai Lama, taking Chinese territory, being unfair to China in various international forums, and therefore it's a country with which there's a lack of trust and so on. So that's one set of views that they have. The second is, of course, a general perception that they've left India far behind in the race. And that really, this is a country of similar size, which is very poor, ridden by caste, religion, conflict, backward, unable to develop. That's a sort of view. The leadership, in my opinion, however, has a much more realistic view. And that view is that it is a country which is shown strategic autonomy. It is not completely aligned the way Europe or Japan or Korea or Philippines or Singapore is to the West. It has a history it's proud of. It's not likely to simply cave into the West, and it has had a bad experience with the West in the 18th and 19th centuries. That it is economically developing much faster now than they thought it would, so that although the gap will not be covered for 20 years, but that process of rapid growth has begun, and therefore it's not going to be the same India in 2030 as was there in 2020. And I think most importantly, there's a growing sense that the current government has revised the whole idea of geostrategic risk and strategic patience, so that there is a willingness to react in a negative fashion to what China does, rather than simply to wait it out or act passively. Now, that's a big thing, because Chinese diplomacy and foreign policy is not like the West, based on force. It's based on a perception of the threat of use of force and the likely response you will get, because the objective of their foreign policy is to make you do something without actually using force. It is not like the West to deploy force to make you do something. So the moment the perception changes that this is a country which is likely to counter-react or counter-respond to what you do, then immediately their whole perception of that country changes. And I think that is what is changing. Now, I have no hard evidence, because, China is increasingly becoming a place which is more and more closed, and therefore access to information or access to people who are in positions of authority are less and less. But certainly from the writings which are available, I get the sense that they realize India is changing and that they need to make adjustments. Notwithstanding that, I think they're still fairly confident that they are far ahead of India economically, technologically, and militarily, so that India doesn't pose a challenge to them.
As Sun Tzu had said, appear strong when you are weak and appear weak when you are strong. As a matter of trivia, is it true that India gave up the opportunity in the 1940s for a permanent seat on the UN in favor of China? You read that every now and then.
Yeah, you read
press.
that, and of course a lot of people have said this, but I really have come across no hard evidence that we were offered that it was a hard offer. The US and the Soviets said this from time to time, but in the Cold War it was almost certain that if the Western power said it, the Eastern power would say no. Because it was a bipolar world, and it is highly unlikely that any diplomacy was so skillful that you would find with both sides. In fact, it was a time you had to choose sides. So I would say that even if this offer was made, and perhaps the offer was made by one or the other party, it was not something which would really get acted upon. So I don't give much credence to this view. But I think now it is time to make it clear, because the global order is disintegrating, that if you really don't want to have this situation reach a point of no return, you have to reform the Security Council. And by any stretch of imagination, demographically, territorially, economically, in terms of contribution to the UN peacekeeping forces, on any scale, India is an obvious candidate. I mean, you can't rule out India on any. We are the world's most populous country. We are the seventh most largest country territorially. We will be, by the end of this decade, by any stretch of imagination, the third largest economy. We have the second largest contribution of military forces to UN peacekeeping operations. I mean, on any scale, if you look at our diaspora abroad, the number of students abroad, I mean,
It's absurd that we're not.
how do you
Yes.
leave out India and then still claim that we are democratizing the international system? I mean, if 1 out of every 6 people is an Indian and she or he has no say, then you are not democratizing the world. So I think the time has come.
So inherent in that is your belief that the UN still has a purpose to play in this.
I think international organizations have a purpose to play, but they are not being able to serve the purpose simply because their composition is of an era which no longer exists. So unless they are modernized, they can't play a purpose. And isn't that true of or even of domestic institutions? I mean, in any country, unless you modernize a domestic institution, it fails to function. So it works in international relations in the same way.
So wrapping up the final 2 questions then, you were based in Hong Kong. I'm not sure if that was before or after handover. We've seen massive change in Hong Kong. We had the 2014 umbrella protests. We had the 2019 millions of people, 1.2 million people on the road. And then through lockdown, this massive change in regulations with the internal security law. It's 25 years on. It's a short while to the end of the one country, two systems agreement. Where do you see the future of Hong Kong fitting in all of this? When China got it, it was a large part of its foreign exchange reserves. Today, less than 2% of the total contribution. Such a massive change. What happens?
So I was in Hong Kong when the handover took place. I was in Beijing when the handover took place. I was in Hong Kong when the negotiation took place, the Sino-British negotiations. And of course, I was in Hong Kong in 2018 and 19 as an ambassador to China. So I've seen Hong Kong over a period of 40 years, practically every year. I think we don't give enough credit to the wisdom of the Chinese leadership that they allowed this tiny piece of Chinese territory to remain in British colonial hands for almost 40 years after they took power, simply because they realized the economic value of Hong Kong and the geopolitical value of Hong Kong. I think that goes to the credit of the Communist Party of China, and it shows you that they are a thinking, rational leadership. Now, the agreement itself was brilliantly executed because it allowed the British to leave Hong Kong peacefully and for China to take back Hong Kong without in any way giving the wrong message to the bigger prize, which is Taiwan. And that was the one country, two systems. We are all one people, but you keep your system for the next 50 years. Therefore, I think that the current leadership's decision to introduce new laws to constrict and restrict the Sino-British agreement and its, whatever clauses there are, is, I think, a strategic mistake. Because at the end of it all, while Hong Kong no longer serves an economic purpose, as you yourself said, it's a marginal part of the Chinese economy, it serves a huge symbolic purpose. It shows to the Taiwanese that there are alternatives to complete absorption, and it shows the rest of the world that this is a mature country which is handling the issue in a very, very proper fashion. By doing these laws, national security laws, arresting a lot of activists, banning protest, and so on, they've actually essentially undone the work of Deng Xiaoping in Taiwan. And made peaceful reunification much more unlikely, much more reluctant. And globally too, has raised concerns that if they can do this to a country, to a territory where there is an internationally recognized treaty, then what happens if I invest directly in Shanghai or Beijing? Because then I'm entirely subject to Chinese law, whereas here they've signed an international treaty they are bound to, and they are violating provisions of it. So I think they've done a lot of damage to themselves. But on the other hand, I mean, it's a big power, and at the end of it all, they must have done the calculation that it was better to take swift action rather than allow what they thought in their minds was the poison of democracy to spread from Hong Kong through southern China. And I mean, only history will say whether they are right or wrong. But I think that they've made a strategic mistake.
Final question then. Where do you see, or how do you see the world 12 months from today?
Well, I think we shouldn't look at the world 12 months from today. I think we have to look at the world 10 years from today. And I think 10 years from today, there are, from India's perspective, there are two simultaneous transitions taking place. So we are not navigating one transition. The first is, of course, a once in a millennial transition, once every 1,000 years, and that is the global center has shifted from the North Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. The last time this happened was in the 1500s, when Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus and the whole, European ship, the explorers essentially shifted all activity to the North Atlantic. So that's an opportunity for us. We are back in the center of the world. The Indian Ocean today is perhaps the most important because 50% of all trade passes through it. The challenge is that, of course, the global order is fraying, and we are a beneficiary of the global order. The fact is that if we've had peace and stability, we've been able to develop our economy. This is largely because the world around us was stable, and although our neighborhood was a little unstable, but there was still a global order there. Now we are going to have to navigate this new opportunity with a whole set of challenges. And that includes an unstable neighborhood, a highly competitive broader neighborhood where the Chinese and the United States are locked in confrontation, including in the Indian Ocean region, and a global order where the 5 permanent members of the Security Council simply can't even resolve a matter as small as the Israel-Hamas conflict. So that means you have a lot of choices to make, and these choices are going to impinge on you simply because today Indian business and Indian citizens are all over the world. So the implications of what you do are going to be actual and not notional as they were in the 80s or 90s, when what you said and did didn't matter, because in 90% of the world you neither were you present economically nor in terms of citizens. Now you're there everywhere, so it's going to impact on you. So I think this is really the world that I think we have to navigate. Now, we all said and done, I think the policy of multi-alignment, which is broadly the policy that the government is following, is the right policy. Because frankly, why should we take sides? Unless it's a matter of vital national interest. Otherwise, it's not for us to take sides. Our priority is national development. If that means we have to align with the United States for certain technologies, we do it. If it means we have to align with China because on climate change we are fighting on the same page, we do it with them. And if it means we have to align with Germany, France and Europe simply because we don't want the United States and China to go to war in Taiwan, then we do that as well. I think that's broadly the policy we're following, and it's the only one I think a country like us can follow.
Vijay Gokhale, it's been an absolute pleasure. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Such immense clarity and experience. An absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. I'm sure our viewers and listeners would be enjoying it as well. We look forward to having you back on our show sometime in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.